artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, this is episode 236. DeepMind is the AI company from London started by Demis Hassabis, Mustafa Suleyman, and Shane Legg, which captivated the world's attention with AlphaGo, the program that became the world champion Go player 10 years ahead of expectations. Since then, they've gone from strength to strength, releasing groundbreaking tools like AlphaFold, which predicted protein structures far ahead of previous methods, and becoming a Google Alphabet company. Here today to give us insights into some of the really cool stuff Google DeepMind is doing is Alexandra Belias, Head of Product Policy and Partnerships. She serves as a bridge between Google DeepMind's product policy organization and the policy community. She previously led DeepMind's international public policy work. Prior to joining DeepMind, she was head of international government engagement at Aviva, where she drove policy development and advocacy campaigns on sustainable finance and global trade and investment. She has an MPA in economic policy from the London School of Economics and is currently a tech fellow at the Harvard Carr Center for Human Rights. We're going to talk about Google DeepMind and science policy, the emerging network of national AI safety institutes, the tension between regulation and innovation, AlphaFold and its successors, AlphaMissense and AlphaProteo, their SynthID watermarking detection tool, reducing contrail pollution through AI, and safety frameworks for frontier AI. It's a packed episode, so let's get right into the interview. Well, Alexandra Belias, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. You are Head of Product Policy and Partnerships at Google's DeepMind. And I wonder if you can give us some background about what that is and how you got into it.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for inviting me. So I've been heading our product policy and partnership pod in the public policy team at Google DeepMind. And that's actually a newish role. I started this a year ago. And that actually happened when DeepMind became Google DeepMind. I joined DeepMind 4 years ago, a bit more than 4 years ago. And I was heading our international public policy team. And at the time, a lot of the regulation in the EU was very initial. Canada started thinking about IDA. So it was really a very initial time for international initiatives and governments to think about governance and regulation. So I did this for 3 years. And last year, DeepMind became more integrated with the rest of Google. We became Google DeepMind. And one of the big shifts is that we moved from a primarily research organization to also have products. And so within the policy team here at Google DeepMind, I'm the person who's kind of closer to the products, to the models being developed, the most advanced models that we have, like Gemini, for instance. And I'm working in particular with the responsibility and safety teams to understand some of the concerns we can have, some of the mitigations from a safety and responsibility angles we can put in place. And I come in with my policy/government affairs person hat to think about what the governance discussions are outside of DeepMind to be able to bring them into the internal considerations. So in practice, a lot of my work over the last year has been talking to the internal teams. We've also been doing loads of work with the AI Safety Institute. So I've been doing a lot of this work too. So obviously we work within Google DeepMind, we have a policy team, but we also work very closely with the policy teams within Google who are across a lot of markets as well. And they also help us understand and navigate some of the different discussions taking places all over the world on AI.
How has your job or that job evolved over the time that you've been there? We've seen enormous changes in the last 4 years. We're barely 2 years and a day since the release of ChatGPT, and the world has changed enormously in that time and gotten a lot more attention from governments and other places that intersect with policy. So how have you seen the role of policy at DeepMind and Google evolve over that period?
I mean, yes, it's changed enormously. When I first joined, DeepMind was very much as I said before, research focused, but especially on AI for science. So we were very famous for our work on AI for games, for AlphaGo, where there's a very cool Netflix documentary, for instance. We were releasing AlphaFold, which is really our big scientific breakthrough. So we were really present in policy discussions on explaining the role that AI can have for scientific discoveries. We're thinking of AI as a science, but also AI for science. And I guess with ChatGPT, a lot of the focus has shifted towards large language models, the opportunities that they carry, but also the risk. In the last year, this has also shifted a bit from just LLMs to more frontier AI and more advanced capabilities and what they can mean. So now people are talking more about agents. I think for us at Google DeepMind, we're trying to make sure that people don't just focus on LLMs. AI is not just about LLMs. There's loads of uses still for science that exist. And so we're trying to kind of think about all the different ways in which AI can be developed and deployed that are not just chatbots, because then you kind of miss a big picture of the opportunities from AI.
I very much want to talk about the science, and that might form the bulk of our discussion, but something's on my mind that recently developed, which is a gigantic lawsuit in Canada against OpenAI for content scraping and rights violations, asking for billions in damages. And without getting into legal questions that might be too touchy, how can you comment on that in terms of the policy implications and what it might mean for companies like yours who build models that rely on content?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on this particular case. I haven't even really read about it. But this is a question that's always coming up. And I think, we need to think about AI as one of the greatest tools to amplify and empower human creativity. And the training of generative AI models is a beneficial, transformative use of open web content, which encourages innovation, science, and useful new works. So the way that we've been thinking about this at Google is that we want to support healthy ecosystems and the open web. It's still super early days for this space. And we're really at a time where we're learning and getting feedback from a range of stakeholders. Governments are thinking about this topic a lot. So we're part of loads of policy conversations on this topic. Then, it's interesting seeing, I was looking at the code of practice being developed by the EU. I don't know how closely you've been looking at it, but the AI Act was passed kind of recently in the EU. And the next step for general purpose AI systems is the development of a code of practice. And that's going to be a really massive exercise. I think there's 4 working groups with about 1,000 people involved, which is a very big working group to kind of be a part of. I'm not part of the conversations. I have colleagues who are doing this, but I think copyright is one of the many issues being tackled as part of this general purpose AI systems, and what would be an appropriate way to regulate them. And so I know that the conversations are taking place in the EU, but many other countries are also thinking about it. And I think that's going to be one of the big topics for AI in the next few years. We were talking about science before. And, one of the things that I was just discussing with a colleague before is the importance of kind of scientific data for us to be able to do this work. And so one of my priorities over the next few months is there's going to be a big summit in Paris called the Paris AI Action Summit. So the Paris AI Action Summit is the follow-up from the Seoul Summit and the Bletchley Summit last year. So the idea of the summits are initially a focus on safety, but also kind of a yearly stock take on some of the commitments that were developed. And so I think at the summit in Paris, it's going to be an update on the code of practice that the EU is developing. But I think the French government is very keen to think about how they can use the summit to think about creating data banks, especially for scientific purposes, especially in healthcare. And so that's something that would be really important to be able to even create the AI that can, in the scientific space, move the needle.
And who is the organization and the different bodies behind these meetings?
For the Paris AI Action Summit or the working groups?
Well, the Paris Summit, which you framed as a continuation of work that was in Bletchley.
Yeah, so the Bletchley Summit was launched by the UK government initially. And then the idea is that different governments are taking the helm of organizing the next summit. So we're really at the beginning of the summits. The Seoul Summit was hosted by the Korean government, but also the UK government. And then the French government was next. It's unclear which government will be hosting the next summit. But when we're thinking about international governance for AI, in particular for frontier AI, having some kind of regular forum for these conversations is really important. So what we saw in Seoul and in Bletchley was a series of commitments from labs, from frontier labs, on what they committed to in terms of safety. And so this could also happen in Paris. We're still waiting to see exactly what deliverables will be designed. But they're important considering there isn't really another forum for global coordination on those issues. So this is really a space where we as Google DeepMind are very keen to contribute.
And you mentioned in email the AI Safety Institutes. Is this some sort of consortium of institutes involved in AI safety? What binds them together?
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, it was about the timing of this conversation. And I was saying I was in San Francisco 2 weeks ago. And so 2 weeks ago, there was a big convening of the AI Safety Institutes. These, again, are quite new organizations. The UK AI Safety Institute was the first one created. It was created within the UK government. And they have a mission, they have priorities. They're mostly focused on advancing safety for frontier AI, but they also want to conduct tests on frontier models to be able to understand the capabilities, but also with the unique advantage that they have, for instance, on national security, be able to test the most advanced models. And so the UK AI Safety Institute has been operating for a year. When I was in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, I also met with the Canada AI Safety Institute called Casey, and they were just 1 week old. So the meeting in San Francisco was the first convening of the global network of the AI Safety Institutes. And so there's 10 of them. There's one in the US, in the UK, Japan, Korea, Australia, Kenya. And so for this first meeting, which was hosted by the USAZ, the idea was for them to have some technical conversations and set their priorities. So we saw at the end of the convening the launch of a few publications, like their mission statements, where they say that they want to conduct research on understanding the capabilities and risks for most advanced AI systems. They want to focus on kind of testing and exchanging best practices. They also allocated, I think, 10 million or more to synthetic content. And they also conducted a joint exercise on a model that was open source from Meta on multilingualism. So you can also already see that it's really positive that countries are setting up these institutes, which are set up to better understand the most advanced AI, and that they're working together. Because what you don't want to have is like a fragmentation of approaches, every country setting up an institute that doesn't really talk to one another. And where, for us, the aim of these institutes is really to help drive safety best practices, in particular where it comes to evaluation best practices and benchmarks. Where there is at the moment, this is really nascent and there's no organization that helps drive a bit to excellence. And so that's where we see ACs playing a really central role. And what we saw in San Francisco was basically the first step of this approach.
It's interesting. If we go back like 5+ years, we had the Future of Humanity Institute, Future of Life Institute, Center for the Study of Existential Risk as university institutes, or they were homed in universities. And now there seems to be a much more coordinated series of national institutes that have been bound together, and they've extracted some kind of commitment for government funding, it sounds.
Yeah, so that's really the fact that I think since the Bletchley Summit in the UK in November last year, frontier AI safety, it's because it's so recent as well, wasn't really an area where government had dedicated resources and capacity. And I think since then, with the network of ACs, we're also seeing that governments really want to understand these capabilities and be able to also, put in place the proper governance around it. And so the ACs are kind of this proto-governance exploratory framework where governments want to understand what these models do, what opportunities there could be for governments, but also what role there is for government to kind of make sure that there are high standards for these models in terms of testing, for instance.
What sort of tension do you see in governments between the need to regulate, the need to keep their population safe, and the need to enable innovation and not be surpassed in the global marketplace?
Yeah, that's definitely the two key considerations at a high level. How do you keep a very innovative kind of space, but also try to mitigate the risks? And, one of the sayings, I think from the CEO of Google, Sundar, is that AI is too important not to regulate well. And so one of the risks, if you're too heavy-handed with regulation, is that you completely hinder or suffocate innovation. And so startups can just go somewhere else to be able to set up and deploy their products. And so I think we've seen different ways in which governments have been kind of balancing the two. I mean, in some cases, because AI is just so new and so nascent, and being able to design the right regulation is quite difficult. Some governments have set up kind of guidance, in particular when it comes to risk management. So you can think about, in the US, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a few years ago already, created this AI risk management framework, which is a massive enterprise. I think it took 2 years to just be able to create it. And it really empowers companies, but also impacted communities, researchers, to be able to think about risks from AI in a holistic manner. And so they went through a lot of work to first define the different risks, define what could be considered trustworthy AI, and then come up with a bit of a structure in terms of governance, in terms of measuring, in terms of understanding the risks from AI. And so they've created they called it the playbook with loads of different kind of actions and suggested kind of sub-actions in terms of responsibility. And so this is something that we know we at Google DeepMind and other companies have done as well, kind of going through the entire playbook and see how it matches and compares with our own practices, kind of doing a gap analysis and seeing how we can improve it. Another approach was taken by the EU, where they have decided to focus on risks in particular. And so they thought about this in terms of whether an AI would bring unacceptable risks or limited risk or minimal risks or high risks. And most of the AI regulation focuses on high-risk AI systems, which are AI that are being used in critical infrastructure, for instance, or education or immigration. And for these AI, there's some much more thorough measures that have to be taken in place in terms of documentation, in terms of the data that is being used, and in general, in terms of risk management. And so kind of in terms of balancing this kind of innovation, the idea is to create regulation that's more targeted towards where the real risk really lies, so at the deployment level, as opposed to just having like a blanket regulation across everything that just stops innovation. So I think this is still very much work in progress. And with AI, the key challenge is how to keep the regulation future-proof. So how do you make sure that the regulation is up to date, considering that AI is evolving and that the risks of AI are also evolving?
Indeed, I believe the EU has already had to start modifying the Act on account of what the generative AI has been doing recently. And what I found in so many of the conversations with people about the risks that come up in this context of policy is that it's rather abstract. It's risks, but in the general sense. And when I say, well, what risks? The answer is, well, if we knew, that wouldn't be so much of a risk. It's the ones that we don't know about that are the risks. So, which is a valid point, if somewhat hard to engage people with. But I want to pivot this to talking about the risks and policy issues of something more specific, because we've been talking about science earlier, and DeepMind is famous for coming out with AlphaFold for protein structure generation, which was just, I just got to put out my admiration for this at this point, because that came at a point where I had been getting exasperated with how AI was being used and saying, really, you've got this technology which could cure cancer and you're using it to figure out what movie to watch next on Netflix. I mean, come on. And then DeepMind kicks it out of the park with taking the number of protein structures that are known from 190,000 to 200 million. And the only reason they stopped there was because there weren't any more to do, at least as far as I gather from that. And the reaction of molecular biologists was, at first was, we don't believe this. And then, okay, we have no choice but to believe it. And the international news has been, at least from a mainstream perspective, rather quiet since then with respect to that, which I find a little odd, because anytime you take the space of knowledge from 0.1% to 100%, it ought to precipitate something pretty major. Can you tell us what's been happening from your perspective around that development?
Sure, yeah. And AlphaFold, I agree, was quite a breakthrough. And I think for me what's been interesting is the breakthrough itself, and then what next. And I think even for our teams here, there was a big decision in terms of, once you have something as critical for humanity as AlphaFold, what do you do with it? And so this is a good example as well of some of the responsibility that comes in terms of deploying some of this work and open sourcing it, which is something that we've decided to do, and kind of provide it free of charge to researchers. For me, AlphaFold is a good example because it's also something that is being used by researchers that are not necessarily AI experts. And so even if you open source the code for AlphaFold, it doesn't mean that a biologist in X country will be able to use it. So a lot of the work that was done after the AlphaFold breakthrough itself was how do you make it available to the scientific community? And so here we work closely with a governmental entity, actually, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, EMBL, and we developed the AlphaFold database. And so you can go on Google, just put AlphaFold database, and you can then put the name of any protein that you want, and it will give you the prediction. And so the fact that scientists would be able to just go and do it free of charge, I think it takes just a few minutes to be able to get the prediction, means that you're able to kind of fill the gap between the AI itself and then the use by different communities. I think for us, what's been the next step after kind of just making it readily available is trying to track how it was being used. And I find that some of the data that has been compiled since has been really impressive. So apparently there's been 200 million users of the database from 190 countries, and 30% have been from developing countries. And I think the fact that you have so many users from developing countries is really exciting. We've kind of gathered lots of examples of how it's been used in practice. And that, again, shows a bit the gap between the researchers in DeepMind who developed AlphaFold, obviously had to learn a lot about biology, but they're not domain experts in every single biological field. So they would not be able to, create breakthroughs in very different areas. So you have researchers from lots of universities who have used the AlphaFold database and have used it for malaria, for antimicrobial resistance, for osteoporosis. I saw one where it could be helpful for pollinators as well. And so they were able to use AlphaFold and see how it could be used in loads of different use cases. AlphaFold was not the only breakthrough we had in this space. We also had AlphaMissense and AlphaProteo, which is about designing high-strength protein binders. And I think all of them are a bit in the space of accelerating drug discovery. Obviously, drug discovery takes a while. So we don't have an exact figure of, thanks to AlphaFold, we've accelerated, being able to solve this particular illness. But being able to see kind of the geographic impact, the amount of researchers who have turned to it. I think another interesting data point that was used is that AlphaFold has helped save 1 billion hours of research just because of the time it used to take before to go through the protein prediction, which was like a very time-intensive crystallization process. It's just been able to kind of speed the discovery process a lot. So AlphaFold is a very positive story. But there's other examples of how AI has been used for science that we have as well. So, we've had Jamcast, which is also how AI can be used to help predict the weather and the rain in particular. So, within 10 days, being able to predict it much more than any other meteorological process. There's been another interesting point about how AI could help with nuclear fusion by controlling plasma. There's been, even in like really different fields, one of the AI that Google DeepMind has developed is called Ithaca, and it helps archaeologists being able to decipher, old writings that are barely readable and be able to say when in time they were written. So that's something that archaeologists can use to be able with their work. So there's lots of different areas where AI can be a bit of a tool to help scientists in their work. And so it's a shame that we don't have, a figure to be able to say, how AI has helped. But there's been definitely loads of use cases that our teams have been working on.
And I think those are terrific. I'd like to see more expansive public relations, perhaps drawing attention to that it deserves. And I wonder if there have been any unexpected consequences in this. I mean, you're getting into all kinds of areas of science here, and there might be the occasional minefield, just spitballing here if you're talking about doing things with nuclear fusion. One can imagine if you get too close to certain areas that some people show up from the Defense Department and say, we want to talk to you about where you're going with this.
Yeah, I mean, for every single one of these areas, especially AI for AlphaFolds could have loads of impact on biosecurity. So before we open sourced it, there were lots of discussions, first internally on thinking about the potential risks, thinking about potential ways of deploying it, doing our own ethical and safety assessments, going through the internal governance processes and channels that we have, but also talking to external experts. So I think for AlphaFold, we spoke to over 50 biosecurity and biosafety experts to understand what the potential risks could be from releasing AlphaFold. And so I think that's where, it touches on a broader discussion of open sourcing, where, it's really important to support open science because that helps accelerate innovation. But at the same time, when you make an AI open source, you can't really reverse it and you make it available to kind of any actor. So there's lots of stages in the middle that you can put in place to make sure that the risks are mitigated, but by first doing your due diligence with the safety experts to see what the risks are. So an example here for us on AlphaFold, when it was initially released, we didn't include any of the virus predictions because we were concerned that this could be used by malicious actors. But then there's other examples of how you could release this work still and make it available to scientists without creating the risks of malicious actors touching on them, would be to have stage releases or having structured access to particular communities, for instance, that have kind of done some kind of QIC. So we haven't had examples of very negative uses, but we have been speaking to lots of stakeholders. I mentioned EMBL. We've been speaking to governments as well about those releases. And obviously, this is why the AI Safety Institutes were created as well, for governments to be able to understand these capabilities and potential impacts. And so what the AI Safety Institutes are focusing on are really the dangerous capabilities of AI. So they haven't been really looking at nuclear fusion, but there's so many other areas which could contain risks in the future. And so they're being very thorough in thinking about how do we make sure that proper mitigations are being put in place as well.
And you bring up the biosecurity. I remember years ago, many years ago, being horrified to discover that the DNA sequence for the Ebola virus and pretty much all of the bad ones, along with the good ones, were freely downloadable. And that could be, in theory, input into a DNA synthesizer and you can get it out. DNA synthesis isn't as easy as it sounds, but nevertheless, that was something that was already out there. Now, my biology is somewhat incomplete on this point, but you've gone this further step into protein synthesis. And with that concomitant biosecurity risk lurking around the corner in different ways, is that something where you can go, all right, this is getting into some territory which we're not the experts on, but there are people who are. We'll establish some sort of partnership with government body or whatever that it is charged with handling biosecurity and turn that problem over to them?
First, this is taking place 100%. And I don't think we would turn the problem to them. I think it's with someone to be responsible for what we've created. I do think this, as I mentioned with AlphaFold, there was definitely a massive effort to include experts, 50 of them from different initiatives, academia, from think tanks, to help us understand those risks. And governments definitely play a role. I think this is where having an ecosystem that's very robust and has the appropriate funding on biosecurity and how they intersect with AI issues is really important. So one of the things that we're also calling for is to make sure that governments, when they think about AI and funding for AI, is that they also think about funding PhDs or having units like the ACs who think about these risks to be able to have expertise in government, but also outside of government that think about these issues and who are able to bring a diverse perspective. I think companies need to play a very key role because they're closer to the development of the AI and they can, very early on think about the risks. But it's really important that before deployment, there are discussions with external experts that bring in sort of an external perspective, a more diverse view, a more expert view as well from the outside on what the risks could be. So yes, definitely that's really important. You were mentioning something that had happened before. And one thing that we're also trying to understand is how much actors are going to actually look at AI tools as being, something that they want to use compared to the existing ones. And if you think about it, a lot of this information is already out there. LLMs are basically just kind of saying something that's already out there. And then for more narrow tools like AlphaFold, this is where the role that we play, making sure that if we put something and make it readily available, especially free of charge, we need to make sure that it can be used for like an nefarious purpose.
There is so much that you've got going on at DeepMind, and to the uninitiated, it might look like these things have so little to do with each other, where you've got products that can be the world champion at chess and Go and protein synthesis. And now you also have a new product, SynthID, which detects watermarking in AI. And that's getting into an area of great contention at the moment because of the intersections with education and homework plagiarism especially, but also obviously intellectual property. And well, maybe since it's so new, you could start out by describing for us what SynthID is, what it does.
Sure. So SynthID was actually released, I think, over a year ago now in its first modality. And so SynthID is a tool to help with the identification and watermarking of AI-generated content. And so initially, it was SynthID for images, then sound, then video, and then a few months ago, we released it for text. And what SynthID does is for Google products, so there's basically a verification system where it's able to say that, yes, we can say that this image or this video has been generated by one of our AI. And so as you say, that can be used to detect plagiarism. I think for us, that wasn't necessarily the first idea. I think there is so many discussions around AI being used for disinformation and deepfakes. For us, SynthID was part of the responsibility pillar of our work of, if you're able to create all these videos and pictures, you should also be able to say that it's been generated by this AI. And so SynthID has been kind of part of this work. For us, it's been really important just at the beginning to say that SynthID is not a silver bullet because one, it's also it's very robust. I remember the image one was robust to 20 modifications that people could make to images, like cropping or changing the images or enlarging. So there's been a really big effort to make sure that people couldn't go around it, but things could change. And so in the future, it's possible that we need to keep pace with this. The big breakthrough for us has been for text watermarking, which is quite difficult. And what we've done is also open source the methodology behind it, which means that other organizations can also now use the text watermarking. So it's important because it means that it wouldn't be just for Google products if other companies decide to use it. And so, obviously SynthID can be one of the many solutions against this information, but it's not the only one. There's so much that needs to be put in place in terms of, people even understanding if an image has been created by AI or not. And I think it's also something that existed before AI, the fact that images weren't always truthful or had been, modified with Photoshop. So it's part of a longer history, frankly. But we're very proud to have SynthID as one of the tools that can be used. It's really interesting seeing how governments are prioritizing synthetic content. I mentioned this convening of the AI Safety Institutes in San Francisco 2 weeks ago. And they had the US AI Safety Institute that was hosting this big convening had made synthetic content one of the 3 pillars of discussions. And the ACs, the AI Safety Institute, decided to put 11 million towards tackling synthetic content. So it's definitely something where more work is needed at the international level. And SynthID will be, a small part of, the solution.
And these different technologies for images, videos, and text are very different technical solutions, but they're also very different use cases. And while the text one would be easier to defeat because of the amount of information and frequency is available and the ease of modifying text, it's also a different case from images being spread around where the misinformation space is one that's inhabited by a lot of casual use. Someone creates something, throws it out there, and in seconds it's doing the rounds, and they just wanted to generate some clicks. And if the social media platforms had some sort of filtering mechanism that would stamp these with some kind of mark that said, this has been generated by AI, it would do something to limit that spread, or at least it would shift the problem in some respect. Now, is that a direction that you see this going in? Because obviously the utility of this is much more limited if it remains only for Google products than if it's as widespread as possible.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So watermark is not supposed to be visible to the human eye.
Right. What I meant was that the social media platform could detect the presence of the watermark and then put a thing underneath a caption that said, this has been generated by AI.
I think this is where it's not really a SynthID or Google issue, and it becomes more of a governance and ecosystem decision, where when it came to political parties before the elections, a few organizations committed to, whenever they created an AI picture or it was modified by AI, to actually disclose it. And it was part of the campaign to say, hey, if we're going to make an image, we're going to disclose it. So it would be up then to different platforms to decide if they want to do it. It could be a good decision. I think there's definitely a question of, do you consider Photoshop to mean that it's been, how do you then disclose it? So there's lots of kind of layers to it. And I think this is where having loads of solutions to it is helpful. So Google also has this, about this image where you can check when an image comes from. So there's lots of different tools that can be used to kind of check the authenticity of a picture. But it's true, there's no kind of wide across all platforms, I guess, way of just thinking of verification. So I think it's definitely a bit of a space for governments to come in. And that's where the money from the AI Safety Institutes could be used to find more holistic solutions.
Well, you said that the safety institutes were talking about disinformation and synthetic content. And when DeepMind gets into that space with SynthID, do the safety institutes see that as a response to consider in how they approach that problem? What do they do with it?
Yeah, so I think for them, SynthID is a good example of a technical solution, but only kind of a small part of the solution. And they know that there's other policies that need to be put in place. As we were saying before, asking individuals or companies to disclose if they've used AI to generate or modify an image. So that's why, SynthID is just a small part of the problem and the solution.
When you're getting into so many varied areas, biology to gaming to social media, what other diverse areas can we expect to see or have seen that I'm not aware of from DeepMind? What about, for instance, climate change? Because the impact of AI power consumption on that is a very hot, pardon the pun, topic at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the discussions around AI and climate change are, there's many angles to it. We know that AI consumes energy, but AI can also be a solution in many ways to climate change by helping track, by helping make things more energy efficient. Maybe a few examples that I can use from our side. Way before I joined, DeepMind had done a pilot on data centers and seen how AI could be used to improve their energy efficiency. And I think at the end of the pilot, they had found that they could reduce by 40% the energy used for cooling of those data centers. Another example that I found quite cool is that there was a pilot, again, between Google and American Airlines. And they were looking at some of the pollution that's created by planes. I think they're called claytrons. They're the lines that the planes create that apparently create loads of emissions. And so again, they used AI on 70 flights and they were able to reduce the emissions by 56%. So I think right now, a lot of it is anecdotal and AI hasn't been used systematically to kind of, reduce emissions and improve energy efficiency across all this. But there's definitely a really big impact that AI can have. So I think this is going to be another kind of really big hot topic in the future, is how can we make sure that the opportunities and benefits of AI are kind of sufficiently targeted towards, helping tackle climate change.
Was that contrails you were talking about with the planes?
It was contrails, yeah,
contrails,
thank you.
Yes. I almost hesitated to mention it because of the conspiracy theories around it, but you're talking about the particulate emissions that cause condensation, which is why they become visible. Nothing to do with secret government.
No. Thank you for clarifying.
So there are so many areas that DeepMind considers within its purview. What holds them together? How do you decide what is the next thing or what is a valid thing to get into? Is it got to be a big wicked problem in the educational parlance, something that is of global interest? What are those conversations like?
Yeah, and I should say, obviously, DeepMind is Google DeepMind, and so we're part of Google, which is a massive organization. I think the way that what DeepMind is focusing on now is frontier AI and what's next for these most capable models. So the key model family that we're working with is Gemini, and the idea is what's next for Gemini. So at I/O last year, we released a research prototype that we had, which is Astra. I don't know if you saw the video, but it's quite impressive. There's a lot of narrative around agentic AI, which is not just a chatbot that reacts to queries, but agentic AI would be able to think ahead. It will be around planning. It can take action. It can have a better memory. So in the Astra demo, at some point, it walks around and it can remember things. And it's also, there's more personalization, which are more aligned to individuals' preferences. So I think there's definitely kind of what's next for AI after Gemini. And something that our CEO often talks about is AGI, so general artificial intelligence, which, people have varied views in terms of how far away it is. Some people say 10 years, some people say 3 years. The definition of AGI, but even of frontier AI, is something that's very dynamic, that there's no kind of complete agreement from the AI community on. And so I would say that, moving forward in the capabilities is definitely a priority, but in a kind of a safe and responsible way. And so AI for science also remains a really big priority for us. And there continues to be work around, AlphaFold that is taking place. So as you said, there's many different teams working on different things. The work on SynthID continues, the work on AI for science continues, as well as the work on Gemini, obviously. I think for us, what's really exciting is seeing that AI can be integrated in so many ways and have an impact in so many domains. So there's definitely kind of loads of opportunities ahead. So I wouldn't be able to tell you just one answer, I'm afraid.
Right. And I think that is the answer. And I know DeepMind, before it was Google, had on its homepage that its vision was artificial general intelligence, which brings me to a hypothetical question. The non-hypothetical part of this is that last month, the US-China Commission released a report to Congress, putting as its number one priority that the United States should establish a Manhattan Project scale effort to develop artificial general intelligence as soon as possible. Their words, not mine. I am not paraphrasing. And that clearly, given the name of the commission, this is about international competition. Let's say, as a thought experiment, that happens. The United States government does create this ginormous effort to develop artificial general intelligence. And of course, they're going to involve Google in some way, or they're just not going to get very far. What do you fantasize the phone call to you looks like, sounds like, when that happens?
Yeah, I first say that I think governments have been thinking about AI competition for a long time. I'm originally from France, and digital sovereignty is a really big topic. And I think this is just a continuation of what we're seeing. I think that's why I mentioned the AI Safety Institutes, and I'm very happy to be closely working with them, because they're here to also think about the safety aspect of it. And they're also the interface between labs and governments, and helping governments understand capabilities, because otherwise it's a little bit easy to say, to badge them under kind of a big name. So, what we've seen in the last year is that the key labs have been working with the AI Safety Institutes and sharing their models. And so there's definitely ongoing conversations about what the most capable AI systems can do right now, and governments are kind of listening, and they're also comparing notes. I think there's broader discussions about how governments are collaborating as well. And I think, international governance is something that we haven't really touched on, but that's also really, really important. And so the conversations on competition between countries are one thing, but there's also been many, many conversations about more coordination and global governance. So we've seen, initiatives that didn't exist before, like the UN High-Level Advisory Body, the recommendation to create some kind of international IPCC for AI that would be helping governments understand capabilities and risks and safety together. The OECD has been doing more work. We mentioned the global network of ACs. So there's definitely been an effort for governments to also collaborate more on the safety aspects of it, which is definitely a really important part in terms of, one, understanding where AI is heading, and two, how to make sure that their governance is comprehensive and doesn't lead to global fragmentation or duplications, but actually to kind of some form of coordination, harmonization.
Thank you. This conversation in this hypothetical scenario here makes me think that risk is contextual. Like, we don't allow toddlers to have assault rifles, but we do insist that our troops are armed with them, and because they have the training and the mandate to use them. Now, one can imagine that extending to AI, and now we have AI that can be used by anyone who can just fog a mirror and open a web browser. And there's a lot of conversation about what is and isn't safe for them to use. But in the other direction, I can imagine there being conversations about, we have researchers here. They are trained in managing risk. We want them to be able to use AI that is capable of dangerous things, and ditto with defense departments and so forth, that in different contexts, there are people who would not only be capable of dealing with more risk, but would need the benefits of that. Do the safety institutes and your policy discussions address some sort of graduated risk level depending upon who is using the AI?
I mean, there's lots of conversations about communities, especially for high-risk AI. But that's maybe a good transition for some other work that's taking place. And it has very different names depending on the companies. But we're calling ours the Frontier Safety Framework. And that's something that, as a big convening that I mentioned 2 weeks ago, there was also a really big discussion around this. And so Frontier Safety Frameworks, there are a set of protocols that we have set up to address severe risks from powerful capabilities from the most advanced AI. And so this is very exploratory work. We've published a first draft. We're working on a second one. We're implementing this at the moment. But what it does is set up a series of critical capability levels where we think that, some form of threshold where we need to think about more advanced AI when it comes to biosecurity or to machine learning, R&D or autonomy, and think about what increased mitigations need to be put in place. And that's something where OpenAI also has it. They call it the preparedness framework. Anthropic called it their responsible scaling policies. And governments are definitely thinking about this a lot. So at the Seoul Summit, this was part of the commitments for companies to develop this frontier safety frameworks. And so it's a little bit what you're talking about in terms of really thinking about the risks and thinking about, as these capabilities increase and the risks increase, how do you put in place the right mitigations across different companies developing these models? So that's probably one kind of other development over the last year that's really essential for the responsible deployment of advanced AI.
Is there any discussion about perhaps some form of certification, like can't drive a car, fly a plane without being certified by an appropriate national or international body? Has anyone discussed the possibility of some kind of certification in order to be able to use more dangerous AI?
Yeah, so this is somewhere where, because this is so nascent and kind of exploratory, it would be hard to have a certification that, would be accurate, but also not out of date quickly.
Right.
And so that's where the AI safety institutes are coming in place to try to understand how this is evolving. And so the idea here is for them to, have technical discussions with the researchers developing this AI and understanding what the potential risks are. But because of the dynamic nature of AI and the way that it's evolving and some of the impact that we need to consider, this is where kind of a more dynamic policy response is also necessary.
Right. And it's one of those ideas that sounds good at first blush, and then the moment you look at it, then sounds impossible. Well, just to move towards a conclusion here, what's coming up in the near future or as far out as you can see with respect to your work and the work of Google DeepMind?
Yeah, maybe for my work, I think one of the milestones I'm most excited about is the Paris AI Action Summit, because it's going to be a really big gathering of policymakers and companies and civil society to think about the opportunities from AI and also the risks from AI. And I think when it comes to AI, the conversations are often divided in different, fora. So you have discussions that are focused on the good. I think that what the Paris Summit is trying to do is really try to have as comprehensive as possible a discussion, where they're covering sustainability, AI for science, but also still they're going to cover the AI, the EU AI code of practice as well. And so it will be really exciting to see kind of the connections between the two. I think when it comes to AI, a lot is about weighing the pros and the cons, the risks and the opportunities. And so for me, it will be important to do this in a really inclusive manner, which is what the French government is trying to do by inviting not just a few labs, but also by really making it something that civil society is also invited to. So yeah, for me, that will be a really important milestone when it comes to national governance, because right now there are quite a lot of initiatives that have been set up, but they're not connected yet. So that's kind of my hope for Paris.
Fantastic. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to mention about what's happening in the parent company that is particularly on your radar?
I mean, that's all I can think about right now, but I feel I've been talking for a while. But
Yes.
this has been great.
It's been fascinating. So thank you very much for the work that you do and for taking time out of that important work to come and talk to us on AI and you, Alexandra Belias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter.
That's the end of the interview. For me, one of the big takeaways was learning how the Global AI Safety Institutes, as you heard, we just got one in Canada, came about and are coordinating with each other. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, Physical Intelligence, a startup based in San Francisco, unveiled Pi-Zero, a machine learning system that enables robots to perform housekeeping tasks that require high coordination and dexterity, like folding clothes and cleaning tables. Pi-Zero is a modified version of the pre-trained Polygemma vision language model. The authors modified Polygemma to accept embeddings that represent the robot's state and previous actions, added a neural network to the input to turn the current time step into an embedding, and modified Polygemma to be a mixture of experts model. Pi-Zero outperformed the open robotics models OpenVLA, Octo, ACT, and Diffusion Policy. Some observers call Pi-Zero GPT-1 for robotics. Do you remember GPT-1? No, you wouldn't, but you know what came a version or two later. Next week, we'll have our special traditional end-of-year show, when we look back over the past year and think ahead to the new one. We are taking a more holistic slant on that, with anthropologist Beth Singler and philosopher John Zerilli returning to the show to give us a cultural hot take on 2024 and the trends into 2025. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at AIandYou.net. That's AIANDYOU.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.